All That's Left is made possible by our Patreon supporters. To help us continue this work, please consider contributing at patreon.com/leftvoice and make sure to visit our website at leftvoice.org. Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Odin, and one thing that we on the left love is unions. Unions have really been in the news and on a lot of people's minds lately, especially this year. In April, workers at a warehouse on Staten Island in New York formed the first ever US Amazon union. There's also been a wave of unionizations at Starbucks, where so far over 100 stores have won their unions, and over 250 more stores have filed petitions to unionize. There have also been unionization efforts at Apple stores, Verizon stores, Trader Joe's, and at many other companies. And at the same time, union approval rates in the US are at their highest point in decades. Over 2/3 of Americans support labor unions, and over 3/4 of Americans support the Amazon unionization effort specifically. As we'll discuss today, there are a few major reasons behind this unionization wave and behind the renewed effort in labor struggle. The coronavirus pandemic certainly played a big part because it showed that workers are essential. Workers learned that they were essential and not their bosses, and we also learned as workers that the entire system depends on our labor. The pandemic, of course, came after decades of neoliberalism had already chipped away substantially at jobs, wages, and working conditions, and overall has made life increasingly precarious for the working class. We're also seeing the rise of Generation U, where U stands for union. And this is a new generation of workers that was really forged in the Black Lives Matter movement of recent years, particularly during 2020. This movement has evolved to include deep discussion of the ways that capitalism disenfranchises the specially oppressed, from attacks on Black lives to attacks on trans rights and many other groups and rights. So, it's become really clear that the state and the system works for capitalists at the expense of the working class. Many of the workers who are driving today's unionization efforts, for example at Starbucks, are seeing the connections between their own oppressed identities and their role as exploited members of the working class. At the same time, only around 10% of Americans are part of a union, compared to over 20% in the early 1980s, and even higher percentages before that in certain sectors. And labor and unions overall are under attack. Union busting, including things like retaliatory firings, are happening in full force at Amazon. Starbucks and other companies are also experiencing these kinds of union busting tactics. And attacks on the working class also keep coming in other forms. So in the form of inflation, which eats into our paychecks, austerity, cuts, rollbacks of democratic rights and other rights. But we can't just fight for more unions. We also need to fight for class independence, and independence from both Democrats and Republicans. We need to fight for democratic unions led by rank-and-file workers. And all this, of course, needs to be part of building a political organization that truly represents the interests of the working class and oppressed. Again, independent of the capitalist parties. We need unions, and more than ever, we need a fighting labor movement. To discuss these topics, my guest today is James Hoff. James is a writer and editor here at Left Voice. He's also an educator and a labor activist based in New York City. He teaches at the City University of New York. James, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Odin. Thanks for having me.
So, unions are a huge and really important topic that undoubtedly we'll cover more in the future. And as readers will know, we do cover this extensively on the website. But I wanted to use this discussion to talk about kind of a few different things In part, I was hoping parts of this could be a bit of a Unions 101 episode to touch on what unions are and what they do. I know you're very experienced with the union at CUNY in particular. I want to also talk about the ways that unions' power can get limited. And then also I want to talk about, of course, the thing on everyone's mind, the fact that there's a big wave of unionization right now and kind of what this means for the future and other struggles. But let's start with a pretty straightforward question, a real beginner question here. What are labor unions and why are they important?
Thanks, Odin. Yeah. So sometimes beginner questions are the most difficult to answer. But yeah, I mean, I think if you break it down, labor unions fundamentally are just organizations of working people, right? And I think that's really important to sort of think about. Labor unions are organizations of working people at their workplaces around issues related to their labor, you know? And I think regardless of what labor unions have become, regardless of their sometimes sordid history, labor unions do have a pretty checkered history in some respects. And regardless of how they've changed over time, they're still first and foremost organizations of working people coming together in their workplaces to use their labor power to fight for their interests. And it's this relationship to labor that I think makes unions so important. Because as we know, as Marxists know, the entire economic system of capitalism is built on the exploitation of working people. And coming together collectively and being prepared to withhold our labor through work actions and through strikes gives working people enormous power. If we don't work, nothing works. And if we don't work, there's no profits for the bosses. And, just a little bit, I mean, when you think about what unions are, I think it's also important to reflect on a little bit what unions have accomplished, Historically, they've made really significant improvements in the lives of working people. And that's something to point out, whether it's, the elimination of child labor or the 8-hour workday or the weekend. Lots of really important advances have been made by unions. But as important as these advances are, it's not really the ability to just win this or that particular gain that makes unions so important. I think it's their potential. As the biggest organizations of working people, as the places where workers are most organized, there's some 14 million workers in unions after all. They have more than just the power to win better wages. They have the power to shut down entire cities and entire economies. Logistics workers, for instance, at Amazon, or port workers, they have the power to massively disrupt local economies with a strike of just a few thousand workers, 5, maybe 10,000 workers. And this is really why the state has worked so hard for so long to depoliticize unions and to bureaucratize unions in order to turn them into mere service providers. And unfortunately, I think that's the way a lot of unions see themselves. And unfortunately, it's the way that a lot of working people see unions. You pay your dues, and in exchange, you get maybe some better wages and some better benefits, or you have to give up fewer wages or benefits. And capitalism just keeps trucking along. And in some ways, that's been the deal for U.S. labor for, maybe the last 70 years or so. And I think that's why it's really important for revolutionaries and revolutionary organizations to pay attention to unions, and to contest for influence within unions. Rather than simply rejecting them as conservative or attempting to build workplace organizations outside the traditional unions, we have to work within unions, precisely because they have such an extraordinary potential.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that was really well said and a really great description, especially for people out there who maybe are not as familiar with unions. And just to the point that you made about how unions increasingly over the decades have been depoliticized, bureaucratized. I also just want to point out that although the long history of unions and attacks on unions is a little beyond the scope of just this particular episode, I think it's important to emphasize that this is something that's happened under both types of administrations and both parties. So, although Republicans in particular have been seen as often worse when it comes to union support, kind of understandably, at the same time, it's also the case that Democrats have not exactly, shall we say, stood up for unions across the decades and have presided over a lot of these gradual attacks on the power of unions.
Yeah. I think historically, at least, over a large part of the 20th century, unions have seen the Democratic Party, at least since, maybe the 1930s, they have seen the Democratic Party as an ally, and they've worked with the Democratic Party to try to achieve, legislative goals. And they've been sold out time and time again. I mean, I think if you look at the history of unions over the last, again, like the last 70 years or so, what you see is a decreasing militancy. What you see is decreasing rates of unionization, and increasing like I said earlier, increasing bureaucratization of unions. And a lot of this, I think, stems from labor's relationship to the state and its relationship to the Democratic Party, which has really, in many ways, co-opted, I think, organized labor, and that's really by design, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I did have one more kind of intro to unions question that I wanted to ask, which is that, given everything that's happened in the past few years, especially I think in the past year, people's ideas of unions have changed a lot, but there is a stereotype out there, a stereotype that, I mean, almost, if I'm going to be real stereotypical here, kind of harkens back to like a Soviet era poster of like muscular factory workers clasping hands, clutching, pickaxes. This image of, unions are only for certain types of workers, like maybe for industrial workers and factory workers, people who perform manual labor, earn an hourly wage. And unions are for people who have, grueling jobs that they really dislike. So my next like Union 101 question is, who exactly needs a union, and are unions only for like white men who wear hard hats and go to work and come back home with their faces like smeared in coal from working in mines?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. That's so interesting. I don't. I agree with you. It's certainly a stereotype that is out there, and I wish I could. I really wish I could kind of pinpoint where that comes from, because while of course unions have a lot of history with industrial labor, they've also represented all kinds of different industries. I mean, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, for instance, is hardly. I mean, I don't necessarily think you'd call that an industrial union. So, yeah, I'm just curious where this stereotype comes from. But look, I mean, unions are certain. We know unions are certainly not only for industrial workers, and they're certainly not only for white men. Um, that stereotype, I think, at this point is pretty outdated. And yeah, of course, it's never really been the case. Even less so today. It's true. There was, and I think there still is, a labor aristocracy in the United States. That is a certain sector of usually white, much better paid, often unionized workers, often in manufacturing industries, that make much better wages and have much better benefits and much better working conditions. And maybe that's partly where this idea comes from, is that there is this layer of very of workers who are doing much better than others. But in general, and that's in part because they have unions, sometimes powerful unions. But in general, union membership has actually become less white over time. Black workers, for instance, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Black workers have higher union rates than white Americans now. And white Americans only have slightly higher union rates than Latinx folks. So, if anything, unions are really becoming less white than they've ever been. Meanwhile, the unionization gap between men and women since at least like 1983 has been almost entirely closed. Union participation rates for men and women are very, very close. That said, and I think this is really worth thinking about, the union participation rate as a whole, though, as we know, has been falling over the last, 40, 50 years. And for women, that rate, especially more recently, has actually been falling faster than for men. So while the total overall rates between men and women are pretty similar, the rate of decline is a little bit faster for women now. And I think that's worth thinking about. And I think it's probably related, to the ongoing crisis of social reproduction that was really exacerbated by the recent pandemic. And that crisis of social reproduction has forced women to often to have to quit their jobs or to take on more flexible, often ununionized forms of work in order to take care of children or to take care of family members. And this is because of a real lack in our society of support for social reproduction, and a lack of affordable childcare and elder care options. So I think that's worth thinking about as well. But also some of the most, if we talk about like white unionists, some of the most militant and important labor actions of the last century have taken place in unions and industries that include large numbers of Black workers in particular. If you think about the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement in Detroit, for instance, Drum, that was formed at a plant that was about 70% Black workers. And it's a radical union organization that had a really outsized influence on labor struggles across the country at the time in the late 60s, particularly around questions of civil rights and racism. So, in general, I think unions more and more are for everybody, including those. You asked this question, about are unions for people that like their jobs? I think even for people who like their jobs, it's maybe even more important to have a union. I'm a professor at the Borough of Manhattan Community College at the City University of New York. And I'm represented by the Professional Staff Congress union there, which represents both faculty and staff. And, I like my job quite a bit. It has decent pay. It has good benefits. I get to select my schedule. And it's very fulfilling work. But I know if it wasn't for the union, that work would be a lot less fulfilling, and that workplace would be a lot less, would be a lot more difficult to navigate, because the interest of the bosses, the interest of administrators, in my case, in the case of public sector unions, and the interests of the state are rarely, almost never, the same as rank and file workers who are doing the work. And so having a union there to help fight, to protect the how those workplaces function, I think is really important.
Yeah, to the point of how things would be a lot worse for a lot of people without a union. I think we often see people argue that because working conditions are good or you have better benefits or higher pay than in other places, you don't need a union. And I guess on that note, I should also say that if your boss tells you that you don't need a union because you're quote unquote like a family at your workplace, that's of course a major red flag. But I do want to say that although okay, I'm absolutely not going to argue that unions in Europe are like flawless and like pure examples of workers' power. And even though countries like Scandinavia, they have high unionization rates, of course, our vision of socialism doesn't mean that we need to be more like Sweden or anything like that. But what's really funny to me is that sometimes, and I think this happens in France in particular, is that European countries will sometimes get a lot of media attention for like a huge strike or like a big labor mobilization. And undoubtedly, every single time, you always get, without fail, these conservative people's reaction in the US being like, God, these French people, they have like a month of paid time off. They have like short working weeks. They have great benefits. Like, why are they even striking? These like little weaklings always on strike. And it's like, yeah, I mean, not to simplify things or anything like that, but how do these people think that workers got these concessions from bosses? Like, how do they think we got things that you mentioned earlier, like the 8-hour working week or ban on child labor and things like that? I think yeah, I think that it's such an important point that like unions really are critical, even if you feel like you enjoy your job or it's like objectively maybe better than at other places of work and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, people in countries like France or maybe Scandinavian countries or countries where unions, have a, a more militant tradition. Um, yeah, they have somewhat better working conditions, and they have those better working conditions because they constantly are flexing that strike muscle, and going out there and being in the streets. And that's just to protect what they have. And so, yeah, there's so much more really that unions can accomplish, even than just that.
Yeah, speaking of labor and union militancy, um, a big reason why we are recording this podcast right now is that, of course, although, as a socialist publication and podcast, unions will always be a really important topic for us, they are having a really huge moment in the US in particular right now. I mean, they're being covered a lot in the media. They're at the top of a lot of people's minds. Approval of unions is at the highest in several decades. I'm thinking of course, Amazon and Starbucks, but also at like a lot of other companies as well. There has been really unprecedented steps towards unionizing, like at some Apple stores, even at Verizon stores and places like that. So this question is, I'm sure, very complicated, but I want to know why there has been such a big wave of unionizations lately.
Yeah, that's a really important question, Odin. And I agree with you. I think it's the question of the day, right? And I think it's something that we've seen happening not only like this year, but it's something that I think we've noticed happening probably for the last, I don't know, I would say at least 3 or 4 or 5 years. But I think first maybe one thing we have to do is ask ourselves, are we experiencing a unionization wave? I think that question is worth debating. There are certainly more high profile unionization efforts underway at the moment. And I think two of them that you already mentioned are really important. The victory at the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island was huge. I think that's very important. And not only because it is new unionization, but also of the way that they won that union. And we can talk about that a little bit more later. But And then, of course, Starbucks stores, right? And Starbucks workers. I think they've organized. I don't know. I mean, I think they must be closing in on like 100 stores by now. They've organized a lot of workplaces across the entire country, and that's really impressive. And I really hope, and it's possible that the next batch of Bureau of Labor statistics of unionization density, when it comes out next year, it could show an uptick in unionization rates, and that would be great because if it did, it would be the first time in decades that we've seen an increase in union density, which has generally been falling for a long time now. But we have to be honest about what we're looking at right now. So far we're talking about maybe 4 or 5,000 if you're counting, just Amazon and Starbucks. 4 or 5,000 new union members out of a total union workforce again of like 14 million people. So I think what we're seeing right now is a really important kind of rising. You can maybe call it a rising tide of labor organizing, but I don't know if it's quite a wave yet. But nonetheless, what's happening is impressive and inspiring and should be encouraged and supported.
Yeah, just for context, I actually right before recording, I wanted to look up at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and like you said, although it is very exciting in the current moment, you're right that in the U.S. only around 10% of people, I think, belong to unions, which is I think in the early 1980s this was around 20%, which feels a lot higher. But looking at like internationally, for example, like in Northern Europe, the rates are between like 60 and 80%. So I think that's just a really important point that you pointed out that, putting this in context, I think there is still an uphill battle. And I think it's important to keep in mind that, yeah, it's still relatively low.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. Especially in the private sector. I think the private sector is, don't quote me on this, but I think it's like 6 or 7%. So yeah, a lot of that unionization is in the public sector. But yeah, and so you asked why is this happening? Why does there seem to be this new interest in forming unions? And I think also part of that is we've also seen a fair amount of labor militancy in the last several years, and I think that's a really complicated question. The pandemic, I think, is certainly a big part of it. And this is something I think we've talked about a lot in the website and in the magazine. The pandemic showed working people that they were essential. All of the healthcare workers on the front line were told repeatedly how important and essential they were. And, delivery workers and grocery workers recognized how essential and central they were to the economy and how people would not have been able to survive in the pandemic without these workers, And I think it really clarified in a very direct way for these workers the degree to which the entire system, depends upon their labor. And that is a big part of it. But I think the unionization efforts that we're seeing and the increasing militancy of unions that we've seen over the last several years, even before the pandemic, is part of a much bigger picture. To really understand what's happening now, I think we have to go back to the economic crisis of 2008. In many ways, what we're seeing today is the direct consequence of that crisis. A crisis that marked the beginning of the end of the dominance of neoliberal ideology. I think as a political project, neoliberalism is still quite powerful, but as an ideology, I think it's lost a lot of its influence. And the sequence of events that followed the 2008 crash, from Occupy Wall from the recession to Occupy Wall Street, to this incredible increased interest in socialism among young people, to Ferguson and the rise of Black Lives Matter, the first presidential campaign and then the second presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders, the massive teacher strikes, which were strikes in many ways against the austerity of the neoliberal project in Chicago in 2012, and then across the South and the Midwest in the entire country in 2018 and 2019. All of that is part of a broader shift in consciousness that is sort of brought us to this moment. Um, and add to this, of course, the complete collapse of Black wealth as a consequence of the 2008 crisis and the recession that followed, and the brutal austerity that followed up until at least up until the pandemic. And what Marxist economist Michael Roberts, and I think correctly, has called the long depression that followed that crisis. All of that is leading, I think, especially young working people to reconsider the value and importance of unions, and to recognize their role as workers in society, and to seek to form unions as a way of defending themselves against really the worst aspects of a capitalist economy that is clearly in decline. And so, when the pandemic hit, working people were, I think, already primed to take action, and now, of course, there's this whole new generation of young workers entering the workforce who are really conscious of, like I said, of the value and importance of unions. I think it was Forbes, or it might have been the Washington Post. You can correct me, Odin, if you know, that called this new Generation U for union, for precisely these reasons. They're a generation facing economic collapse. They're a generation facing climate change, facing ongoing pandemics, and I think these high-profile unionization efforts that we've seen, even when they're unsuccessful, are only going to inspire more unionization efforts. And so I think we should expect to see a lot more of this, and I hope we do see a lot more of this going into the future. I am really crossing my fingers that the next BLS report, or maybe if not the next one, but the one after that, is going to show some meaningful upticks in labor density. But we'll see.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there, I think it's super important to take kind of the historical long view a little bit and really think about how, yes, although the unionization wave is fairly recent in the past year, I think it's really important to look back a little bit more. And something I also wanted to build on just a little bit is what you mentioned about Generation U for union, and the importance of social movements in recent years, like Black Lives Matter. And I think the BLM movement really brought home the point for a lot of workers that the class antagonisms that really are foundational to capitalism, these antagonisms produce the forces that oppress workers in their other identities. So things like racism, ableism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these are byproducts of a system that divides workers to make it easier to exploit and oppress under capitalism. And workers, I think, have, especially young workers in Generation U, have really realized that due to these major social movements recently. And although I think to some extent there is still this this large mentality of like artificial lines between like bread and butter issues like pay and hours versus like social justice issues like fighting oppression, fighting racism and transphobia, this still does exist for sure, this kind of artificial division. But I do think that like for younger people especially, this artificial divide has really started to fade a lot with this newly politicized generation and the movements they've been a part of. I'm thinking about an interview that I think we did with a Black worker at the Bessemer warehouse in Alabama, who talked really explicitly about being inspired by the BLM movement and how they see that like fighting for better struggles at their workplaces are actually part of the struggle for racial justice. Or something like, for example, the media union that Jezebel is a part of, where trans inclusive healthcare was actually a specific demand that they had in their contract negotiations. So I think it's super important, like I mentioned earlier, and like you described really well, to take the long view historically, and also really important to see that all of these struggles are interconnected, and it's not possible to just like extract this unionization wave and the fight for labor militancy from the fight for Black lives, for example, or the fight for trans youth and things like that.
Yeah, I agree, Odin. That's important to emphasize that, right? Yeah, a lot of I think, the Black Lives Matter struggle itself radicalized a lot of folks, obviously. And a lot of the people that were organizing at Amazon in Bessemer and in Staten Island are clearly influenced by that experience. And we're fighting also against racism. Chris Smalls, for instance, faced all kinds of racist attacks from the Amazon management, and when he was fired and after he was fired. And then, of course, like you said, Starbucks too. That's being led by a lot of LGBTQ folks and a lot of trans folks who, in particular, are really interested in protecting their access to trans inclusive healthcare. So, yeah, I agree completely. These struggles are all absolutely connected to one another.
Yeah, speaking of Chris Smalls and kind of going back to the basics of what's emerging from this unionization wave and like the basics of unionization, one thing that I think occurs to a lot of people who are really new to this topic is that unionization is like weirdly hard and like weirdly complicated. Like I don't want to sound naive or assume like a kind of like a Pollyanna-ishness on the part of our readers and listeners, but I do personally, like to be completely honest, remember wondering like a few years back during the big media outlet unionization wave, I was kind of thinking like, okay, like Vice Media, like they want a union. Can't they just like raise their hands at a meeting and make a union? So my question to you is, how do union elections work and why are they so weirdly complicated?
Yeah, an important question. Also, I think on one level, you could kind of raise your hands in a meeting and form a union if you wanted to, and you could have a big discussion, and you could walk outside, and you could decide to go on strike. But that wouldn't technically be an officially recognized union by the U.S. state, and so. Working people who want to form unions in the U.S. are up against a very complicated system. Yeah, like you said, it is very hard. Forming a union in the U.S. is not an easy process for a lot of really messed up reasons. And I think the biggest of these reasons is that, like I said, union formation is controlled by the state. You know, I think it's strange in a country that prides itself so much on its First Amendment right to free association, that it puts all of these limits and restrictions on the formation of unions, and limits and restricts the way, especially, and this is not an accident, obviously, but especially the way that working people can come together and organize. Without formal recognition of the state, unions and the working people that form them really have little or no protection against employer retaliation. And like I said, I really think this is intentional. Up until the National Labor Relations Act in 1935, and then later the Taft-Hartley Act, which comes after the war, unions had little protection. But they also had far fewer state restrictions imposed on them. So this meant in general that unions in the late 19th century and throughout, I would say, the first half of the 20th century were much more militant than they are today. I think there's a lot of reasons for this. This has a lot to do with economics. It has a lot to do with material conditions of working people at the time. But the decline of labor militancy is also in large part something that has been created by the state and by state intervention and state control and state co-optation of labor. And yeah, so the way that unions are formed is a big part of that. Currently, legal recognition of unions requires certification from the National Labor Relations Board, which is led by presidential appointees appointed by both Democrats and Republican presidents, who are almost always, in one way or another, representatives of the business interests. Whether they're lawyers or whether they're academics, they're almost always either in the pocket of business or extremely sympathetic to business. Marty Walsh, our current Secretary of Labor, is the first actual former union member or leader to hold that position for almost 50 years. The other, like I said, the other folks have all been lawyers or academics. And even Walsh, of course, is no great fighter for working people. I mean, he's a clear proponent of business unionism. For Marty Walsh, I think in general, he thinks what's good for big business is good for labor. And so the certification process for a union is by the National Labor Relations Board, led by people like Marty Walsh. It's very complicated. And it can often be held up by employers, sometimes for years at a time. But to take a step back and talk about like the process of forming a union, it begins with collecting signatures or cards. Basically, this is when workers or sometimes union reps working on behalf of a group of workers at a particular workplace go through the really long process of going out and meeting with individual workers, talking to them about the union, and convincing them to sign a card or a petition that says that they would like to be part of a union. And if you can get at least 30% of workers to sign cards like that, then the National Labor Relations Board is technically required to call and to help organize a union vote at your workplace. Now, sometimes if you can collect a majority of signatures of folks that say they want to be in a union, you can convince your employer to, quote unquote, voluntarily recognize the union. But in my experience, that rarely happens. And it certainly isn't going to happen at a company like Amazon or a company like Starbucks.
Yeah, because they're not a family there. No,
because they're a family. That's right.
Yeah.
That's.
But so okay, it sounds like it's a two-step process where just because a lot of people sign union cards and actually basically say that they want to be in a union, they still have to just like do this one more time with the NLRB's backing and acknowledgement.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big part of what makes it, I think, so difficult to form a union. It's like you said, it's this two-step process. I mean, just getting enough signatures on cards is a huge endeavor. And then to prepare for and successfully win a vote after that, when the employer is doing everything in its means, legally and almost always illegally, to influence that vote and to intimidate workers to vote no against a union, it makes it really difficult to win a union. So, I mean, like this kind of retaliation, of course, like I said, is highly illegal. But from the perspective of the bosses, the penalties are far more preferable than the cost of doing business with a union. And so they're happy to break the law and to pay the consequences. Of course, a lot of the time it's hard to prove retaliation, and companies have really good lawyers to advise them every step of the way to help them cover their tracks. And so it's that working people are really often ill prepared to win these votes as a consequence. Um,
In particular in the US, since there is, now it's slipping my mind what it's called, but you can basically in this country kind of fire someone for almost any reason. In contrast to some other countries, like again, going back to especially places like France and where it's relatively much harder to fire someone. You have to have actually very, very good reasons to do so.
yeah, yeah. Most workers in the United States are at will. And without a union, you're right, there's often very little protections against being fired for almost any cause. Yeah. Um, and just briefly to come back to what you were asking about the Democratic Party earlier, unions have been lobbying the state, particularly the Democratic Party, for a long time to pass laws that would make organizing easier. And they've been unsuccessful in that. And I mean, we're talking about big unions that have put millions of dollars into lobbying and into getting the vote out for Democratic um, candidates, and they've received very little in exchange for that. You know, there was the Employee Free Choice Act, for instance, which was proposed by now. It's been so long now; it's been almost 15 years. That actually would have allowed for what's called automatic card check, which is basically that if you can get 51% of the union, I'm sorry, 51% of the workplace to sign union cards, then you have a union automatically. That there's no need for the voluntary recognition of the union. Um, but of course, the Employee Free Choice Act never passed, and it's has since really disappeared. Um, and the Democrats didn't take any action to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, and even now there's this new watered down version that has been put forward, which is called the PRO Act, Protecting the Right to Organize Act, is also effectively dead in the water. Biden promised that he would pass it. He put Marty Walsh in the Labor Department with the idea that he would pass the PRO Act. But that hasn't happened either. And the PRO Act, of course, is in many ways weaker than the Employee Free Choice Act, and also comes with a lot of other restrictions that really would tie unions even more to the state. So that's one of the consequences of labor unions working with the Democratic Party, is that they become more and more entwined in the state. But even if workers can successfully, like I said, even if workers can manage to get enough cards signed and can successfully call an election, like they did at the warehouse in Bessemer, the boss still has plenty of opportunities to stall or to undermine that vote. And I think we really saw this happening at Bessemer. Amazon really went on the offensive against the union vote there. They were spreading disinformation, making threats to employees, of course, forcing employees into mandatory anti-union meetings. And eventually they were successful. They defeated the vote there. And I think it's important to point out, especially at Amazon, there's such huge turnover rate at Amazon. I think employees don't stay for longer than 9 months or something. 9 months or a year or something is the average. And so many of the same workers who signed cards in that vote, the same workers who had long conversations with union organizers, many of them had already left by the time that the vote came around at Bessemer. And so those who did vote, the new hires, had faced nothing but company intimidation since the day they were hired. And frankly, it's not surprising that those workers were afraid to vote yes. Afraid that if they did, that the warehouse would close or that jobs would be lost, and that's how companies often win. And just to add to that, I mean, even when unions do manage to win an election, then they face this long certification process that can also be contested by the employer, sometimes for years. and sometimes forcing a new vote, again, with a whole new group of workers. This is what is currently happening at the Amazon warehouse in Staten Island. Amazon is filing all kinds of frivolous lawsuits, claiming that organizers there broke the law, that they gave, I think one of the claims is that they gave marijuana to employees to sign cards or to vote yes. This is really intended only to slow down the certification process, and in turn to therefore slow down the beginning of contract negotiations. And employers can really stretch that out, again, for a really long time. At Columbia, for instance, at Columbia University, where the graduate students organized, it took them more than 5 years from the time their union was recognized to the time they got their first contract. So yeah, it's a rough haul the whole way.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting figure when it comes to Columbia, where it took 5 years to reach a reverse contract for a lot of grad students. I mean, they'll have come in and out the door at that point, and a lot of workers will have left the university at that point. So that really puts in perspective that stalling is such an effective tactic for them. And I think also to the point of frivolous lawsuits, I mean, I think that also is something to keep in mind with companies like Amazon and Starbucks and these companies that union bust and bring up these lawsuits, is that they have so many resources at their disposal to fight unionization, which is just, they really just dwarf the resources of unions and of workers in these kinds of battles.
Yeah, even big unions like the RWDSU that they have millions of dollars in their coffers, and they were defeated by Amazon.
So you did mention things like betrayal by the Democrats and union bureaucrats and things like that, and I think it's really important that although, as we've mentioned, we're really excited about this union wave, it's not the case that we need to just universally applaud all union leaders, all union tactics. And I think also kind of on a separate note, it's important to also acknowledge that it's not the case that the more unions we have in the US, the more socialist the US will be or anything like that. So I did want to touch a little bit on these tensions and kind of ask a little bit more of a critical question, which is that you and others have written a lot about the tensions between, in particular, the union bureaucracy and the rank and file. And you've mentioned these a little bit in passing so far. Could you talk a little bit about the difference between who the union bureaucracy is and the rank and file? And why do we as socialists emphasize the importance of the rank and file in particular?
Yeah, and why criticize the union bureaucracy? Yeah, as bad as the bosses are, union leaders have also historically played a really reactionary, and I think an increasingly reactionary role in labor unions. And when I say leaders, I don't mean worker leaders, but I'm talking about the ranks of the administrators of unions that have grown really considerably in the last 30 or 40 years. Jason Kozlowski, for instance, published a really great piece for us in the magazine recently about what was the title of that? It's a bureaucratic revolution in the labor movement, in which he does a really good job of showing the way that the numbers of bureaucrats within the leadership of unions has really increased dramatically since the 1980s. And labor bureaucracy is not new. It's always played a conservative role in labor politics. I would say since at least the formation of the American Federation of Labor, in 1886. Samuel Gompers, for instance, the founding president of the American Federation of Labor, really viewed labor's role in contrast to some other labor unions at the time as really a negotiator with the boss and with the state. He had a vision for creating more stable, long-lasting union organizations run by paid leaders and professional organizers that could work to win small improvements for working people without disrupting or interrupting the flow of capital or production. Um, and like I said, Gompers was in part responding to more militant ideology of previous unions, like the Knights of Labor, which which had tried to use the power of organized working people, unskilled and skilled, of all races, of all ethnicities, to win major political and legislative concessions from the state by taking often more militant actions, such as the 8-hour workday. But after the founding of the AFL-CIO, the American Federation of Labor fuses with the Congress of Industrial Organizations. I think since then, most labor unions have continued to follow that model put forward by the AFL. And this has led to a whole layer of professional union leaders who are completely separated from the day-to-day interests of the workers that they supposedly represent. Not only do the labor bureaucrats not have to work in the same conditions as rank and file members of the union, they also tend to get paid much better. And I think worst of all is that their contact with and their ongoing compromises and negotiations with representatives of the ruling class and the bosses and the state mean that they generally have a very different relationship to power and a concessionary relationship to capitalism in the state. The labor bureaucracy tends to see rank and file militants, that is the folks on the shop floor, the union members who are at the point of exploitation, those workers who might want to take more radical action like strikes or illegal strikes or even sabotage. I think they see the rank and file in many ways as a threat to their existence. And therefore, the politics of the labor bureaucracy becomes a politics of accommodation. And, their job is really to reproduce themselves and rather than actually working for the benefits of the workers that they represent. And they do that only as much as they need to in order to secure their positions for themselves, because, of course, their positions do, in some extent, depend upon being voted in by workers on one level. And I think this is perhaps best seen in the relationship between the labor bureaucracy and, again, the Democratic Party. A relationship that has worked its way all the way down into the very ranks of unions, where ordinary union members are often convinced. It's not just the leaders, it's ordinary union members also are often convinced that their interests and the interests of the Democratic Party are linked. And unions have time and again provided cover for the Democratic Party and U.S. Imperialism especially. And this is really one of the most tragic things, I think, about the current state of labor, which is that, labor unions, as a place where workers are most organized, is also the place where they're being co-opted. And so this is why rank and file workers are so important from our perspective. Rank and file workers and what folks like Kim Moody have called the militant minority are essential. And organizing among the rank and file around more militant demands, and importantly, I think a program of political independence for unions is also really important. The bureaucracy is never going to break from the control and influence of the Democratic Party without a real push from below. And ultimately, this is, I think, this struggle for the hearts is for the hearts and minds of the rank and file union members. And it's a process that can be sped up by class struggle. And that, to me, I think is really important. The more that rank and file insist on militant actions, the more they come into conflict not only with the boss through strikes and work actions, but also with the leaders of the union and the Democratic Party, uh, the more that they're going to be willing to take political struggle for the control of their unions as independent rank and file workers.
So, one thing we mentioned earlier was that although there are a lot of stereotypes about unions that people don't necessarily hold anymore, I do think there is one belief that people often do still have, which is that the point of unions, whether they're the grassroots unions that you just described earlier, or unions that are maybe more bureaucratized and things like that, is that they are there to make things better for you at your particular workplace. So, like, your union's supposed to help you get better pay and better benefits. It's like a kind of a service provider, as you put it earlier in this recording. Um, Things that we often refer to as like bread and butter demands. But at the same time, because of the importance of labor struggle under capitalism that you discussed at kind of the top of this episode, unions can play a big role in a lot of other battles and a lot of other issues that we're facing right now. So, as a way of wrapping up this discussion, can you connect to the importance of unions and unionization to things like, for example, the anti-war movement, the war in Ukraine, maybe even like the fight for abortion rights and LGBTQ rights?
Yeah, sure. I agree completely. Labor can is not only can fight for more than bread and butter issues. I think it absolutely has to. Um, I think militant contract struggles around bread and butter issues, struggles that involve wages and benefits, are really important for raising the level of activism and participation in a union and getting more rank and file members used to the idea of going on strike, for instance. Um, but ultimately, the power of unions to make radical changes in society extends way beyond the workplace and way beyond workplace demands. Um, by using the control of our labor, like I said, we can shut down whole cities if we want to. The Seattle Soviet in 1919 is one example of that. And recently, we've seen small examples of that kind of militancy as well. The ILWU, for instance, the International Longshore and Warehouse Workers Union, is one good example of that. They regularly, you were asking about the anti-imperialism or anti-war. They regularly engage in actions and work stoppages to protest everything from racial injustice to U.S. imperialism to Israeli apartheid. And these strikes are usually just one-day strikes. They're mostly just symbolic. But like we were talking about with some European unions, which do have these mass strikes all the time. Sometimes it seems like, it seems almost just as practice. I think these strikes by like the ILWU are important, for keeping that strike muscle working and keeping the idea of those kind of, reminding workers really of where our power lies. If workers don't get to see examples of strikes, and again, like we're talking about here, not just strikes for slightly higher wages, but strikes for like the Chicago teachers did, strikes for better funding for schools, or strikes like the one in recently the teachers in Minneapolis, which that was really important, right? Those teachers were going on strike for racial justice for their mostly Black and Latino students. For smaller classes for them, but also, for more counselors for those students who were really suffering through the pandemic. And so, when I think when workers see examples like that, it's really important because, again, like the pandemic, it's a reminder of the power that working people really have. And we've seen some those are a couple examples, but we also saw unions come out in support of Black Lives Matter. And we saw some rank and file members in 2020, for instance, like bus drivers refusing to cooperate with the police. Those kinds of actions are all really important ways that unions can, show their power to intervene in things outside of the workplace, for demands outside of the workplace. Now, with regards to abortion rights and the war in Ukraine, frankly, I'm a little disappointed, I think, right now, at least, with how absent labor seems to be. They've been at a few demonstrations that were called for defending abortion rights, but, in very small numbers. Many unions have issued sometimes some very good statements, for instance, about the impending overturning of Roe v. Wade, but there doesn't seem to be much preparation for taking any kind of work actions in response. And frankly, I think that's what's going to be necessary if we're going to push back against this decision, and if we're going to win, what we need, which is a national law that makes abortion free and safe and legal for everyone across the entire country. In my union, for instance, very progressive union, an academic union, they've sent out one email asking members to join demonstrations when Planned Parenthood called the demonstration in New York City. And that came only after the leadership was badgered repeatedly to do so by rank and file delegates. With regards to Ukraine, there have been also, I think, a lot of petitions and statements. But with the exception maybe of rank and file airport workers in Italy that we recently wrote about, who refused to unload U.S. weapons to Ukraine, there haven't really been any actions or demonstrations that I know of by labor. And again, this is why it's important for us to fight to make unions into political spaces. By building rank and file committees in our workplaces to take up ways of using the leverage of organized labor to affect real change. I think there's a lot of potential for that with regards to the threat to abortion rights. Even a small group of people organizing in their union around the question of abortion rights can have a big impact in terms of moving members more towards action. But that starts with the rank and file. And I can guarantee that there's no union bureaucrats currently sitting around planning a mass strike when the decision to overturn Roe v. Wade comes down. We're going to have to make that happen ourselves, and we're going to have to drag the bureaucracy along with us if we want to win.
James, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Hopefully this has been a helpful introduction for listeners who are maybe newer to unions, but who've been following this really exciting unionization wave. We also, though, want to encourage our listeners to take this fight into your own workplace, and also, of course, keep supporting this really important movements that's going on. We, of course, need to support both unionization and more unions and, fighting unions. But we also need to make sure to fight things like union busting and really fight things like the firing of a lot of workers that's been going on at Starbucks and Amazon, but also at a lot of other companies. So these workers deserve our full solidarity. Follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter at @left_voice. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, and share the show with your friends, your family, coworkers, classmates, comrades, and anyone else who you want to radicalize. And finally, Left Voice is an independent, revolutionary socialist publication, which means that we completely rely on the support of our members and our sympathizers. So that we can continue to bring you more episodes of All That's Left, please subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/leftvoice. We're really excited about this project, and we hope that you'll join us on this journey.